Welcome to Straight to the Point. I'm your host, Representative Joe D'Orsi. In a world of long-windedness, I'm here to deliver you the Capitol News in 10 minutes or less. So, let's get straight to the point. This is the Straight to the Point podcast. I am Representative Joe D'Orsi, and I have a special guest phoning in today on the podcast. He is Jeff Piccola. His resume speaks for itself. Former House of Representatives Republican whip and senator. Jeff, thanks for joining.
Glad to be with you.
So, Jeff, I mentioned your resume. It's one of exceptional experience in government. Can you just walk us through your career in state government?
Well, very briefly, I spent 19 years, beginning in 1977, in the House of Representatives, focusing mostly on judicial and criminal justice issues out of the Judiciary Committee. And then I moved over to the Senate in 1995 and spent 17 years there and focused mostly on educational issues, serving for 13 of those years as the vice chairman of the Education Committee, and then the last 4 years as the chairman of the Education Committee. So those have been my areas of focus over those 36 years.
And we share, of course, a passion for education in common. Speaking of education, particularly school choice, Jeff, were you not involved in the original push for school choice, which resulted in EITC, OSTC scholarships here in PA?
Yes, I was. In fact, former Governor Tom Ridge deserves the credit for elevating school choice as an issue in Pennsylvania in the mid-'90s. And he is the one who promoted the concept of vouchers, the concept of the EITC, and very important, the charter school movement, which I helped to lead the way on in the Senate back in the late 90s, early 2000s.
Yeah, so thanks for your service there. And this, you've certainly passed the baton. Of course, we had last year a historic expansion of EITC, OSTC dollars in the budget, and almost got Lifeline scholarships done. And I've since been working on universal school choice, so it's definitely a movement that has a lot of momentum now. So, Jeff,
yeah, I think school choice is probably, and I'm biased, but I think from the perspective of state government, it's probably the most important issue you can deal with, because over a third of your budget is education related, and quite frankly, from my experience, and I haven't seen any change, a lot of that's wasted. But if you get parents involved in the process and determining where they think the best educational opportunities lie for their kids, I think you will get better results, and I think you will save money.
Couldn't agree more. And that's a good segue to my next question. It's about the 2024 budget. From my vantage point, and I might be biased because in my first budget season last year, we didn't get a budget done until mid-December. And of course, the unofficial due date is June 30th. I kind of feel like we're going to repeat that this year. There's been very little talk about the budget. We even had just the other week the Speaker of the House cancel a couple of session days in mid-June, which is usually when we roll our sleeves up and get to work. And there's been very little talk about communication with the Senate and the Senate Republicans and the House Democrats. So, Jeff, what first of all, what's your prediction about this year's budget? And then maybe you can go into the budgets of yesteryear and maybe tell a story about a time when you got it done early, perhaps, or maybe quite late, like could be the case this year.
Well, I'm not as close to it as you are, but I don't see any movement toward a finalization before the end of June. Segueing into your question about the past, the reason you have late budgets, in fact, you may recall Governor Wolf and Governor Rendell, I don't think they ever had budgets on time. The problem is, that's not a problem, but it's just the fact of life. When I first came in the legislature, if you didn't have a budget on June 30th, nobody got paid. Welfare recipients, prison guards, anybody who received a state salary, any vendor who was selling things to the Commonwealth, nobody got paid. Over the years, with legislation and primarily with court cases, that has eroded. And generally speaking, life goes on if you don't have a budget on time. Now, there are some exceptions to that. My first budget, going back to the 1977 78 budget, we didn't pass it until the middle of August, and we held the non-preferreds hostage until December in order to round up the tax votes to support the budget. So this late budget thing is not anything that is new. I think Governor Wolf even broke that record in terms of the longest time without a budget, except people were getting paid, so it wasn't as impactful. But there are we one time when the Republicans controlled the House and the Senate and the governor's office, we passed the budget the first or second week in May. So that, I think, is about the earliest in modern history.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's nice that you kind of covered the misconception that if a budget isn't done by July 1st, people aren't getting paid. That I had to explain that to a lot of constituents who are reading headlines, of course, and like you had mentioned, that fact has eroded over time. Do you think it's a good thing if that's the case, because it would put our feet to the fire?
Well, it depends on your perspective. Late budgets tend to do one of two things. They tend to adversely and negatively cut spending, or they negatively and adversely raise spending. So the idea that it is a bad thing not to have a budget on time, I think, is probably right, because you go the wrong way in one direction or the other. But and more often than not, it's raising spending, because the two sides both have their spending priorities, and once you get past that June 30th deadline, everybody's priority tends to get attention more than it would if you force the issue on time.
Yeah, very interesting perspective. So, Jeff, I have to ask you, since your tenure in politics, which was, a pretty storied career, what has changed? So, if you were to look out in your past and in the years that you served up here in Harrisburg, compare it to the 2024 feel for politics and state government. What's changed?
Well, I can pretty much sum that up in one word: polarization. The two parties are polarized. I mean, we used to work well across the aisle. Now, we didn't agree on a lot of things, but we found ways to work together and get something done. The idea that if I could get 80% of what I wanted, that was a win, was the prevailing thought in those days. Now it's all or nothing from my observation. There's very little interest in compromising. Internally within the parties, there's polarization. Yeah. That doesn't help matters much at all. And I think generally I think the news media is partially to blame for this, because they and you know this, Joe, as a public official, you're trying to get attention from your media, local and state, and they have an agenda. They're not there just to report the news. Some of them do a fairly good job of that, but a lot of them, if not most of them, have a liberal or a conservative or a radical agenda. And if it doesn't fit their narrative, they either won't report it, or they'll report it in a way that misconstrues the issue completely. So that is very disheartening, because when I started out many, many years ago, you pretty much could count on the news media to be pretty straightforward. They would report. In fact, I remember we invited local newspaper reporters into our local county caucus meetings under the understanding that they're just for background and you could trust them. I can't imagine that happening today.
Yeah, and among the institutions that Americans trust or mistrust, on that mistrust list, the mainstream media is right at the top. So we're in the lightning round here, Jeff. I just want to ask you about the future of the Republican Party in a legislative governing sense. How can the party help folks? How can we focus on the things that matter? What should be our message headed forward?
Well, as I said at the beginning, I think the most important and impactful issue on the average or the average Pennsylvanian and American, for that matter, is education. It's a very costly subject, and rightfully so. But it also wastes a lot of money, and it's very ineffective in many instances because it's just not getting the job done. So I think to the extent that you can improve education, the delivery of services, the efficiency of services, our Constitution explicitly says that the General Assembly shall provide for a thorough and efficient system of public education. And if you can accomplish that, I think you have done a major service to the people of Pennsylvania.
Yes, very, very good stuff today here, Jeff. He's Jeff Piccola. He's the former House Republican whip and senator in the great state of Pennsylvania. Jeff, thanks for joining the Straight to the Point podcast.
My pleasure. Thank you.
This has been Straight to the Point. Visit repjod.com/mypodcasts.